Hello, my name is Raewynne Whiteley, and I'm the Deputy Director of Discipleship and Lay Ministry in the diocese. As you can probably tell from my accent, I was born in Australia. My father came from Belfast in Northern Ireland. He grew up in East Belfast, Protestant area, and his family attended a conservative church. They thought the Presbyterians were too liberal, unlike the rest of their extended family. He then emigrated to Australia in the late 50s with the £10 passage and found his way to an Anglican church there. My mother grew up in Sydney and was sent to Sunday school by her parents, I think a Methodist church, but as she grew older, she eventually joined the Anglican church too. I think it was because there was a youth group there. My parents met and were very much influenced by the Billy Graham Crusades. And then they married, moved away and joined a Baptist church, which was more similar to my father's background. I was dedicated as a baby, as was my brother, but they soon after moved to an Anglican church. And although we moved around the east coast of Australia because of my father's job, we continued to go to local Anglican churches. I was eventually baptized and confirmed when I was 14, and then went to university, stayed at an Anglican hall of residence, and began to study theology part-time. I was an active member of a big evangelical church. I had a sense of call to ministry from the time I was about 12, although I didn't know what that would look like. At the time, women were not ordained in Australia. And it wasn't until the mid-1980s that the discussion about women deacons meant that ordination was at least possible. My church had lots of training courses and I went to them all. One of them was preaching with me and 11 men, all older than me. I was known as young Raewynne. And it was there I discovered a gift that was totally unexpected and a passion for preaching, which has really shaped my life ever since and shaped my sense of call. I went to theological college after working for 3 years for the government. We had a policy that you had to work before you could begin training. And I went to an evangelical theological college in Melbourne and used to socialise and drink at the Anglo-Catholic college. I was ordained in Melbourne, but served in Sydney and then Newcastle diocese for my curacies. The church in Australia is somewhat similar to the Church of England in that it is very diverse. Different dioceses have very different characters. So Melbourne Diocese, my home diocese, is a really mixed diocese. It has two theological colleges, as I said, one Anglo-Catholic and one evangelical. And the parishes are a real mix. Sydney, on the other hand, is conservative evangelical, perhaps the most conservative in the world. And so it's a very different culture. Women can serve as deacons there, but not as priests. And then Newcastle Diocese in Australia is north of Sydney, and it's predominantly Anglo-Catholic. I served in a kind of broadly evangelical church there. One thing I didn't mention is that I began theological college at a time when women could still not be ordained priest. That was 1992. And I still remember sitting in my bedroom, listening to the radio and hearing the news report that General Synod here in England had approved the ordination of women as priests. That soon happened as well in Australia. And so that by the time I was finished my training, the way was clear forward. After my curacies, I moved to the United States. My passion for preaching had not waned, and so I went to do a PhD in homiletics, that is preaching, at Princeton Theological College, which is a Presbyterian theological college. There are very few places in the world where you can do a course-based PhD in homiletics. One of the things that studying at a Presbyterian college made me or made me realize is how much I loved my Anglican tradition, particularly the prayer book, which is a real gift. Having a set of words where you know exactly what's coming. There might be variations, but it's broadly there, versus not knowing what was going to happen in the service and being dependent on the person leading it for the words that you would be asked to say. I also really value the balanced sense of word and sacrament in Anglicanism. That is, that we consider both important. And that, of course, has been a very important part of my life, because my doctoral work was on the relationship between word and sacrament in the early English Reformation and its implications for preaching today. After finishing my PhD, I went into parish ministry in the States, firstly in a little parish in New Jersey, and then in a larger parish on Long Island, New York. One of the interesting things about the church in in the US, is that ever since the time of white settlement there, religion has been about forming a new identity, breaking away from something and forming a new identity. So the Pilgrims came for religious freedom. They left what they had and they formed something new. What that has led to is a tendency in the US for religious groups to split. So if one group doesn't like what another group within their tradition is doing, they form a new one. So Anglicanism there is very much shaped and was very much shaped originally by Anglo-Catholicism. They trace their liturgical lineage back to the 1639 Book of Common Prayer from Scotland, whereas we tend to focus on 1662 and in Australia too, which goes back to the 1559 English prayer book. That Scottish prayer book is a little more Catholic in tone. One of the breakaways happened in the late 19th century over the prayer book, and there have been a number since. So that's meant that what has remained in the Episcopal Church, which is what the Anglican Church there is called, is a more Anglo-Catholic expression of Anglicanism broadly. And then increasingly liberal one as more conservative groups have broken away again. Nevertheless, it's still Anglican. If you go to a service in the US, it will feel pretty much the same as it is here. A few differences in the words, that's all. After almost 20 years in parish ministry in the US, I felt a real call to work in the area of vocation and ministry, and came to the UK, came to the Diocese of Southwark, initially as the Diocesan Vocations Missioner. That was a wonderful experience. One of the differences between the three churches is the way that they do discernment for different forms of ministry. So that in Australia, pretty much anyone can go to theological college, and many people do. My theological college had 300 students, of whom only 20 were full-time candidates for ordination. Everyone else was just studying. And so lay ministry tends to have an informal shape, lots of people doing training and being equipped for ministry in their parishes. In the US, there's far less emphasis on lay ministry. Where it appears, it tends to be a stopgap, something to fill in where there aren't enough clergy or where you can't afford a clergy to do things. There are some levels of ministry, some things are done ordinarily, like taking home communions. That would be a normal thing for a parish to have lay people doing, or to lead the prayers, but it would be very unusual to have a lay person lead a service. Not that common for lay people to preach. So a very different feel there. And then I came here where we have well-established lay ministry in the form of readers, we have church army evangelists. In this diocese, we have spas, and we're currently developing pioneers and children's and youth ministers. Following my time working in vocations, the bishop asked me to head up a lay ministry in the diocese, hence that's my emphasis there. In terms of clergy, the discernment processes are quite different in all three places. But as here, Australia tends to focus much, to a great deal on what happens at a diocesan level. Whereas in the States, it's a a parish-based discernment, significant amount of parish-based discernment, and then a committee at the diocesan level do the examination or the selection interviews. That feels quite different. So every diocese is much more distinct. I think that's typical of the Episcopal Church generally, that each diocese is far more autonomous than perhaps here or in Australia. That in part is traced back to the history of the United States, where each state has autonomy. Some other things that I've noticed moving here are wonderful things, the diversity within our parishes here. In Australia, we have quite diverse communities, but there are a lot of, particularly now, different language services offered. So that tends to make people more homogenous in their own congregation. In the US, because of the way that housing works and the costs of housing and the historical laws that limited where Black people could live, parishes tend to be very distinct. They are Black parishes or white parishes. There's not a lot of mixing. Here, one of the joys has been very diverse parishes. That's partially because of the social housing policies that mean we have mixed communities. So that's been a real joy to me to see the diversity here and to enjoy worshipping alongside my brothers and sisters from all sorts of different backgrounds. And another difference is the way that the structure works. Here we have quite a large diocesan staff and they provide a lot of support to parishes. When I was in the States, I was very much on my own. So it was up to me to work out what I did with youth ministry, or if I wanted to have someone, a lay person preaching, I would have to train them. Everything was about what I did. And that was quite isolated in some ways. Likewise, some deaneries were great and met, but other deaneries, including mine, the clergy just didn't think it was important. So there wasn't much clergy collegiality in the way that I experience it here. Another difference is salary or stipend. I took a 60% pay cut to come to England. In the US, it's very much that you're expected to pay your clergy something relevant or relative to where you live, the incomes there, or what you can afford. That does mean that there are quite strong disparities by race and by gender. Here, we all get paid the same. It doesn't matter if I'm on diocesan staff or in a parish. And there's a wonderful sense of levelling, a sense of us all committing ourselves to one another. Another difference is the way we talk about money. In the States, they have a pledge drive every year, and people write down how much they're going to give that year. It's expected that people be generous. In part because you have such high levels of pay and costs that you have to raise the money. There's a lot of fundraising in that sense. But there is also great generosity. We had many parishioners who tithed, or at least worked towards a tithe. Here it seems a little more low key. Perhaps it's a difference in the culture as much as anything. Those are the main things that I remember or that I think about as I think about the different communities. I'm very much at home here and in the US and in Australia. The one thing that catches me out though still is how we say the Lord's Prayer. Each of us has a slightly different tradition in translation. And I think that's the thing I notice most about the difference. I'm really glad though to be an Anglican, to have that wonderful heritage that we draw on, that heritage of liturgy, of preaching, of commitment to our communities, of engagement, the care of all who are in our environs. Thank you.